Well, glad to be here for another Sunday afternoon class. We are going to talk about common names today. And in English, there is probably no more common name than John as a given name and Smith as a surname. So finding John Smith can be a real challenge, and we're going to see how that works. Well, one thing that you have to learn as you get into genealogy, at some point in time, you're going to have this realization that your name is probably not unique. I know there are some unique names out there because people here in Utah have a tendency to make up names that are basically unique in some ways. But even then, they get copied quite a bit. So, but it's an interesting situation. And if you go back on some pedigrees, you'll find out that everybody named their children the same names as their parents or their grandparents. In fact, in many societies around the world, there's a common cultural, what you might call it, feature of people naming their first child after the father and the second child after, if it's a female, after the mother, and then their whatever, a parent, and then the grandparents and uncles and aunts. So as time passes, everybody has the same names after another. This is particularly true in countries in Scandinavia because there was even a smaller group of surnames possible due to the fact that it was patronymical. And that meant that the children were known as the son of the father's given name. So Peter had a son, his name would be Peter's son, or whatever other name he was given. It's a fairly convenient way to trace the genealogy. You know it for pretty much assured that the next child will be what the next child name will be. But the challenge is that everybody has the same names, and it's not unusual in a place like Denmark or Sweden where you'll have 5 people with exactly the same names, with exactly the same parents' names, and all of the children almost the same names, born at the same time on the same day in the same city or town. So it can be very, very confusing. So the point here is not to just do names, and we'll talk about it. So I learned this lesson really early. I was on a trip to Arlington National Cemetery. I think I was pretty young, and I may have been about 10 or 12 years old or something like that. And driving into the cemetery, there was this big grave marker with my name on it. And so I figured I was buried in the Arlington Cemetery, but probably wasn't the case. But that was only the start, because as I looked further, I found that there were at least 4 people named James Tanner. Some of them had different names, except one was a junior of a James R. Tanner. So finding people with names that are that common is a very common experience and challenging to genealogists, because it seems really tempting to say, I found the person. Here's the guy with the same name. He's living in the same place. And boy, this has got to be the, but there's lots more to doing your research in genealogy than simply doing that. So there's several ways to illustrate the frequency of a name. I think the most efficient ways in English is to go to findmypast.com. This is the British company, actually Scottish, and it has one of the biggest collections of records from Great Britain. Millions and millions and millions, probably billions of records on this one website. It's one of the 4 largest websites out there, maybe 5 websites. In this case, by putting in a surname, for example, you can see how frequent the name is. Now, once you do this a few hundred times, like I have, or more, you'll find out that you get an idea of what the numbers mean. Now, this is the number of records that they find with that surname in their database. And I've seen names that had maybe a dozen people listed with that surname. That's it. And I can tell the person that's doing the research that every single one of those people is probably related to you. But on the other hand, the higher the number goes, the more frequent the name. And this 845,000 plus is sort of the low mid-range of names in England. It's not as common as others, but on the other hand, it's common enough that there can be a lot of confusion about trying to say that the Tanners are all related. Here in the United States, it's very common, especially out in the West here, it's very common for people to say, Tanner, are you related? Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, we're all related. But that's only partially true. There are a lot of the Tanners that are related out here in Utah, but some of them are not. And that because it's a relatively common name in England. And there were lots of people that came here from England. And so the names here are not necessarily related. If you added in my first name, my given name, you would see that it drops to 51,000, but that's 51,820 records of people named James Tanner. So you wouldn't want to get into just simply using that name without doing some more research. The one point that is important to understand is that the more frequent the name, the more difficult it is to separate out people with the same names because you're likely to find that. In one instance in England, in doing research, I found two individuals with the same name, and they had wives the same names. I was not convinced that they weren't the same person. I wasn't convinced that they were two different people and kept doing research and research and research. And finally found them in a census record, and they lived next door to each other. They had children the same names too. And so once you know that there's actually two completely different families here, and they may not have even been related in any way, and there wasn't any way, because I was only related to one of the two families and not the other. Okay, so what happens if the name is really common? Okay, let's get a really common name like the one I'm using for the title to this presentation, John Smith. John Smith, there's 3.8 million plus records in Find My Past of people with the name of John Smith. So you can see the possibility of confusing people with common names goes up exponentially in a way, because the more the names there are, the more likely you're going to find people who live in the same area and as I indicated, even can live next door to each other that have the same names. So this is a very important thing to consider as we're getting back in time and doing research. Now, the other side of this, the actual reality of this, is that each person who has ever lived has a unique niche in the history of the world. In other words, everybody's unique. And they lived their lives as separate individuals. And so they have events in their lives that are different than any other person on the face of the earth or that ever lived. Because of time passage, obviously, even if I have exactly the same name, I live in the same town, I live in the same place, I didn't live during the same time as someone who was older than I was or younger than I was with the same name. So that's kind of the way that it works. And if you understand that all the people in the world have this unique existence, then it is not conceivably, theoretically, if you think about it, you would understand that it's not impossible to find and identify every single uniquely defined and determine and record every individual that's ever lived. So genealogy is seeking after those unique characteristics that will differentiate a person from being categorized as the same person. Unfortunately, that's not the case in a lot of the genealogy that's been done, particularly on a shared family tree like Family Search Family Tree, because it's too easy. It's just too easy to say, oh, here's my John Smith. Well, there's lots of other factors, and I'll talk about some of those factors as we go along here. So the basic rule is just don't ever match common names. Don't ever think you have the same person simply because you found a name of a person that's the same as the one you're looking for. Finding a name that's the same doesn't have any guarantees at all that it isn't an entirely different person. And if you're looking for ancestors, it's a little bit of a tragedy, because if you basically find the wrong person and you start doing the lines back on those people, then you basically left your tree and you've moved off into some never land of make-believe trees, like all of these Lego people that are in this one. Now, this is kind of non sequitur. It doesn't really follow anything that I've been saying, but I just had to put this in here someplace. One of the issues that we run into commonly in the United States because of immigration, and in other countries too, it's the same with any country that's had a significant amount of immigration, that they would be the people who come to the country conform to the naming patterns within the country of arrival. So an immigrant coming from Germany, and particularly during times when Germany was at war with the United States, if they came to the United States, it was not a very popular thing to have a German name, and people would change the name. But it's important to also understand that the person changed their name. The people on Ellis Island did not change people's names. It's a common thing that's been repeated so many times in genealogy, but it's still something that I hear when people are talking and they say, oh, when they came to Ellis Island, they changed their name. And I say, no, they didn't change their name. The people may have changed their name either before or after they got to the United States, but nobody there was officially changing names as the people came through. Another reason they changed their names is because the names were unpronounceable in English and people just couldn't ever understand what their name was. So they changed their name to a name that was more recognizable. And this is another one of the great challenges of the name problem, of course. It has a lot to do with the immigration issues, however, and not the issue of just same name people. So when you're looking at a situation where it seems to be that there are people with common names, they require research in depth. And when we say research in depth, that means using a lot more resources and a lot more source material for each individual that has the name. Once you have that person pegged, it's important that you don't start adding sources and links out to other families simply because the name is the same. So it requires not only research in depth, but research across naming patterns. So you actually have something that indicates that this is a unique person. And don't just gather names. Gathering names is not genealogy. Genealogy is history, and history does not mean that you simply add names because you found someone that had the name that matched the one you thought. And it can be confusing because sometimes you'll have a name that seems to be very, very unique. And it may be something that seems to be very uncommon, and it may turn out to be uncommon in England or in the United States, but it turns out that it's a very common name in some other part of the world. And so don't get locked into the fact that names are the same, have any particular relationship to each other. So in this, for instance, here's a pattern of names. And when we're doing genealogical research, we're looking at patterns and not at individuals so much. You want to know what the pattern of the people is and how their names, how they fit together. And so this is important because sometimes, for example, there may be a blank out there, like the blanks on this particular fan chart. And the question is, well, maybe these people married cousins, and all of a sudden they have the same lines. And so some lines may disappear as people marry their cousins. And so there's lots of different factors here. But if you think of genealogy as a pattern of people, then the pattern becomes unique, and the people in each of the people in the pattern become unique. One of the major things that creates the problem is having a valid parent-child relationship before moving up one more generation. It's too easy to connect up with somebody. For example, I have a line, the Morgan line, that goes back, and all of a sudden there's no parent-child relationships. There's no documents that show that this particular John Morgan was the son of this particular Richard Morgan. But Richard Morgan seems to fit, or for some reason they think that's the person. He's probably because he's more famous than any of the other relatives. And so therefore the line goes back on Richard Morgan. Well, there's no subsequent documents showing any relationship between Richard Morgan and his parents and so forth. And so all we can conclude when that occurs is that there was an end of line at the last person that had a parent-child relationship, and that the rest of those people were not related. And that means the line ends at the first gap in the parent-child relationship. So if you want to have an experience and you're on the Family Search family tree, or even on your own family tree, just go back on your lines, and every time you look at your sources, look for an actual source that says that this child was the son or daughter of this parent. And if you don't have that link, then the chain's broken. You're at the end of the line. It's time for you to start doing research at that level rather than the fact it may go clear back to some king in England or Europe in the 1500s. And that's very common with people who are trying to establish their connections with some kind of ancestral community in the sense of being descended from the Mayflower passengers or daughters of the American Revolution or the daughters of the Utah pioneers or whatever. Over the years, I've just had continual people who will come to me and say, okay, I've traced this person down from the Mayflower people to this point. I've traced my line up to here. I just cannot connect the last two people together. And the answer is always they're not related. That's not the line. Your line is not the one that comes down from the, let's call them famous ancestor. That you've just reached either the end of your line or you've reached a point at which you're no longer related to this remote ancestor, despite the surname and all of that being the same. It's kind of a little bit difficult. And sometimes people would just get mad at me and say, oh, and then they didn't want to talk to me again because I told them that they weren't related to somebody that they knew they were related to. Okay. Now, this is a little exercise in geometry and in a two-dimensional space, like a piece of paper. Then it takes two non-parallel lines to define a unique point. Now, that's simple. If you draw two lines and they cross, the point where they cross is unique. In a three-dimensional space, you need three non-parallel lines because there has to be one to put it in two-dimensional, two to put them in two-dimensional, and a third one to create a point in the three-dimensional. Now, why is that important to genealogy? It's because it's extremely important. It means that we need to know a minimum of three known exact historical events in a person's life that can be documented with historical records to uniquely identify a person. You can't do it with a name and a date. You can't do it with a name and a place. Sometimes, once you get a name, a date, and a place, you can have a unique person. But even then, it may have to go further. So even though there's an analogy to geometry, you really are in the situation where you just have to be aware that you don't have enough information to conclude that these two people are related or that they are the same person because of the name or even a date or even a place, if that's the case, because it's very common to have all three. So actually, we need a location, a date, and a name to start looking for a person. You can't look or just a name because of the reason I showed earlier about the numbers of people with the same names. And a date, no, because many people with the same name were born on or about the same date, very, very possibly because of the fact there's only 365 days in a year. And if you have 1 million people being born, it's going to be very possible that somebody's with the same name's born on the same date. And even if you get a location, that begins to get the point where you can actually do some research and begin looking for someone. Now, one of the things that you need to be able to understand is that the location is the beginning point. And so what you need to do is understand that locations such as New York or Germany do not help much. So when people get on a census record and they say, well, this family came from Germany, well, maybe Germany didn't even exist as a country at the time that it's supposed to be, when the people were supposed to have been from Germany. And census records, it's very common that the census enumerators, people who wrote down the information, whenever they ran into somebody who spoke something that looked like German, they put down that they were Germans, even though German was the language and not the place where the people came from. So it's extremely important, as when you start thinking about what to do, is to begin with and understand the location of the events in the people's lives that are important, even more important than their names, even more important than their dates. Names can be misspelled, dates can be confused or missing or inaccurate. Location is kind of the key to making your way back through the kind of fog of records and place and people that seem to appear in the genealogical community. So if you keep in your mind that locations have to be consistent, and what that means in simple explanation is that as you go back in time, location becomes even more important than it would be currently. Today, we can, my family members are all over the world. On any given week, there may be somebody in countries in all parts of the world. And back in the early days, and most of the places and times that we're looking for as genealogists, that was not the case. People could not and did not travel. When I lived in a small town in eastern Arizona, I was talking to one of the people in the town at that point in time, and they were older than I was by about 5 or 6 or 8 years. And that would put them in their 20s, and I was in my late teens. And the conversation was going like this: well, have you ever been to Phoenix? No. Have you ever been to Tucson? No. Um, hmm. And finally, the comment was made by the person I was talking to that they had never traveled more than 35 or 45 miles from the town in their whole life. Well, that may have been a little unusual at the time that I was talking, but it's not at all unusual as you get back into the 1800s. There's been major studies done, one by MyHeritage, who take millions and millions of names and information about the names and determined that there were very limited places that most people were born, married, and died within about 6 to 10 miles of their birthplace. And it extended a little bit during the 1800s, but surprisingly enough, it's actually getting less, more closely related as you get into the 18th, 19th, and 20th and 21st centuries. People still are associated with those people around them, and that's who they marry, and that's where they live, and that's where they die. Today, that's not necessarily as easy to do, but when you get back into the early 1800s and the 1700s, and you find somebody that's out of location, meaning you have a name of a person that's more than 10 or 15 miles away, you have to begin to think that person is not the right person. It's not the person that you actually want to identify. It doesn't matter if the name is the same and all the other information appears to coordinate. There's just no way for that person to have gone that far to get married or to live. So we have to understand that every person was born and died in a specific location, and so we can start from there. And it doesn't mean that they're the same, but being born and died in the same place, but many times they did. That's more common than not. And so it's easier to differentiate people by location when you look at location and understand that an event has to occur at a specific location on the earth. That's exactly the way it works. So you start research with the most recent events in a person's life. What is that? Death records. There's kind of two or three different ways of viewing this starting place. It's always easier to start with the most recent events, meaning death records, because the further you go back in time, the harder it is to find records and the fewer records that exist. But there's other records that are very important, like, for example, marriage records are in that category. And to start the research with a marriage record is important because marriage records are records that when people get married, it changes the land ownership between the two individuals and their families. So those records are ones that were most likely to be preserved. But when you're starting out from a beginning and going, it's always easier to find a death record, or usually always easier. Now, we need to kind of overcome this concept of the kinds of records that we have in any given time period. Today, here in the United States, we have birth, marriage, and death records. And we often talk about a marriage certificate, a death certificate, and a birth certificate. Well, the involvement of the government in the United States in any of those categories, in birth, marriages, or deaths, has been rather recent. In fact, there are some states in the United States that were into the 1960s and 70s before they were consistently recording birth or marriage or death records. So you can't count on those kinds of certificates. And when we talk about doing research into death record, and one reason that death record is important and each of the other records are important is because they establish a location of an event in your ancestor's life that can be the basis for further research. It's when you're floating out there and you don't have a specific date, or you're ignoring the locations of the items that you've already found, that you have a problem with consistency. And then the rule here, of course, is never skip a generation. If you skip a generation, you're just out into Never Never Land, or as I sometimes refer to it, as the fire swamp or something, because it's really something you have no idea if you're even in the same country or place that your people came from. And so it's tremendously important to have record consistency. And if you reach a place and you can't connect the two families, the parent to the child, you're at an end. You're on a dead end. Now, whether it turns out to be a brick wall, as they call it, or it's just a place where you need to start looking for a wider variety of records, then that's the case. This is also the case when I say don't jump locations, because just so you find that you're somebody that looks like the family and they've got the right names and everything, and then you've jumped 100 miles or 1,000 miles or whatever it is. I had a family of mine that was in eastern Arizona, lived in central Arizona, northern Arizona technically, and they were there their whole lives. They came from Utah as pioneers. They settled in a little town called Joseph City, had changed some names there of the different places, but it was always the same place. And they died there, and they're buried there. And there was inevitably that someone would try to put a child into that family of somebody born in England, simply because the name was Tanner. And so that was something that was always remarkable to me, that someone would just ignore the fact that how in the world would that person. Now, this gets to the basic rule of genealogy, and it's the first rule of genealogy, and that is when the baby was born, the mother was there. And I can't say that enough times. I have to say that to people when they're telling me about their genealogy sometimes, and I have to say, wait a minute. You've got this baby and this mother, and when the baby was born, the mother was there. So how did the mother get to where the baby was born? And that's the question. And so if that mother in Joseph City, Arizona, had traveled to England and had a baby and gotten back to Joseph City to have the rest of the children in the family, it would have been quite a remarkable thing and probably well recorded. And it would have been a much greater space between the two children. So when we get to the question, and this is a question that I ask when I do consultations and help people find their genealogy, and they're just barely getting started, and they don't know what to do. They'll tell me, "Oh, this person's been born in Argentina, or this person was born in Ecuador, or someplace," and I'll say, "Okay, where did the person die, and where's the person buried?" That's your question. Then you have a place to start with. Because obviously, unless there were some unusual circumstances, they probably died somewhere close to where they lived and were buried somewhere close to where they lived also. And so it's an easier way to get started. You can ask the same question about marriage, and you can ask the same question about the person having whatever other type of aspect in their lives. So where would you go to look for where a person died? Cemetery records, burial records, funeral programs, newspaper, death announcements, obituaries, death certificates when available, or mortuary records. Death certificates in the United States, unless it's on the East Coast, generally don't go back before the 1850s. So once you get back to 1850, you're going to start losing some of these records because they're not going to be available. Most of the records here, like newspaper and mortuary records, are very uncommonly used, but are very, very valuable when you can locate them. There are a lot of ways to work your way back, but that's not by any means a full list of all the different places where you can find those records. So if you have any record, and in this case, I chose the death record as the example, you look for additional records in the same location. You work back in time systematically. Like I said, don't jump generations, and make sure that you have consistency in location, consistency in dates, and consistency in the names if it comes up as an issue. Unfortunately, children do change the names from when they were given when they were born, and so that may very well be a difficult situation. And in English-speaking countries, it is often very difficult to find the birth name of a married woman because the birth names are not recorded in some cases. If there is no marriage record, it's very hard to find out what the married record was. Sometimes you can find it from probate records. There's just a whole different way. There's a whole world of research that goes on in finding the women's maiden names. And I'm going to say this more than once, obviously, that don't skip generations. It's not something that you can do. You just basically, by skipping a generation, you are no longer doing research on your family line. I'm sure someone else would appreciate all the research you do, and especially if they ever find it. But that doesn't mean you're related to those people. Now, there's another part of this that's important. It's called cluster research or jurisdictional research. That means that you look for everybody in the jurisdiction. A lot of times people are so focused on their families that they don't think that looking for their neighbors or the people that appear near them on the census records or whatever other records there are, their neighbors is worth the effort. Well, it's very helpful when you're looking for an immigrant because immigrants came and lived in the same area with people that came from their same area in the other country. And it's very likely that if you find one of the people with where they came from, that all the people in that area came from the similar place. But the pattern of the neighbors is something that is important. If you find somebody and then you find another record and it says that they live next door to somebody that was completely different from the person before, then you'd better start looking to see who sold what and what land records there are to determine who actually were the people And many times you can identify the specific person by simply defining the property that they owned and all the adjoining property owners. That's the kind of the key issue there. Search every record. And this is something that I find is overlooked. And that is that if you're thinking of families as patterns, then complete the pattern. And in this case, you're going to search every record series for every family member. On the census records, you not only search the family records for the parents or the person you're looking for, the individual, but you search everybody in that family and see where they were on every census record and see if there's any inconsistencies, mistakes, difficulties, or if you even have the right people. And when I look at the sources that are attached to individuals and I see that they have like a 1930 census and then they have a 1900 census and that's it, then the first thing I say is complete the censuses. This person was born in 1880, 1879, or 1875. Look for him in the 1880, 1900. There is no 1890 census in the US. 1900, 1910, up until when the person died. Find every census record, and that will give you a good basis for then going ahead and finding additional records, because there's going to be a lot of information there that can help you find people. And then look at the people who are in the same place, particularly if it's a smaller town. If it's a very small town and or smaller and they're all in the same county, you can almost depend on the fact that some of the people in the county are with even though it's the same name problem, but that some of the people in the county with the same name are probably related. It's because it's a very small area and it's likely that they're related. It doesn't mean they are, and it doesn't mean it's, but going through the census records, each one for all the people will show you whether they are or aren't related. So here's what happens. This is the place. And often people overlook the fact that the census records not only tell you the exact place where they were when the census was taken, but they also tell you the exact house they lived in and the location of the house. And as you learn to interpret the census records, you can find the exact piece of property on everybody who is listed in the census. And look for families, don't look for individuals. As you begin searching, look at the whole family. I find, for example, people have a family listed and they'll have all the information on one member of the family and no information on any of the other members of the family. Well, unless you know something that I don't know, it's very possible that you got the wrong person, because that indicates to me that you don't understand who this family was. And so that's the problem. And I would suggest that by filling out the families and all of the children in the families and doing the research on each successive child will give you a much better chance of finding the records than if you're just jumping around and doing research back on one line of the family. Traditionally, genealogists in the United States took a family line, like a surname line, your surname, and did that line back through the people who were related, direct relations, your direct line ancestors. That's no longer the case. We very much encourage people to do all the members of all the families that they find and make sure that each one of those members of the family has been well researched and documented. So when you do that, what you'll find is that you'll find that address that I mentioned, and that helps you to identify which Smith family, in this case, John Smith, and that's where he lived. Further, the John Smith in this line with his family is the son of William and an Ellen. Now, both of those are common names, but the combination of William, Ellen, and John is not nearly as common as any one of those names by itself, especially when you add in a specific address. The next thing, of course, is the origin. All of these people came from England, and to find a John Smith who was the son of William and Ellen Smith at a certain address that came from England is going to be very, very much. Then the last one that probably is the most important is the occupation. In this case, he's a glass blower. Good grief. Think about it. How many John Smith glass blowers are there whose father's name were William and Ellen and who lived in a specific town? In this case, in Indiana, in the Anderson Township. And all of this helped to identify a person with a common name. The more you get this detail and the more you understand the pattern of the family, the more likely it is that you're following the right person. In addition to that, if you just think about it for a minute, the glassblower gives you a great opportunity to look for additional records. In this case, I looked for a John Smith, a glassblower, and this may make his identity quite unique. He may be the only glassblower in Indiana with that name, and that makes it much easier for him to identify. And by the way, Anderson, Indiana, where this came from, is a center for glassblowing. There's all of this Indiana glass culture. And when you get into the glass culture, you're probably going to be able to find more records. And your guy may have ended up being a famous glassblower in Anderson County, Indiana. And that would help you to establish who he was and who his family was. So it's the research in depth. It's going beyond the standard questions and the standard responses, and skipping over all of the consistency of all the records. And also be sure you record all the information that you find, because then when you get into a program like Family Search, it's going to be very difficult to determine if all of these duplicate John Smiths are your person or not. And they may come from all different places. Well, what if they don't have any information at all about this? Well, that's another story in duplicates. There doesn't seem to be any reason to, or any way that you can identify, but if they have two or three of the same places, it's possible that they are duplicates, but not necessarily so. And all the time you're doing this, don't wander off the path. Don't move off into Never Never Land again and get off into a line that's not even your line, which can be easily done by matching names. And the question always is, have you searched for all the records? This is a copy of records from the United States level of records out of the Family Search Research Wiki. And this is a kind of a short list of different kinds of records. Basically, when you look down the sources that are attached to any individual in the Family Search family tree, you very quickly determine that their primary records are birth, marriage, and death, and census records. Other than those, you may have one or two other kinds of records. But in that case, what you're doing here is ignoring all of these records and all of the times and places that these records come from. So it's just an incredible amount of information that can be determined if you work on it. And at the end, double and triple check your entries. Absolutely triple check. Come back and look at them after you've done the work, and go review them from time to time. The more you're acquainted with the family, the easier it's going to be for you to determine whether someone is part of the family or not, and not be adding in people just because they have the same surname. Okay, well, thanks for watching.